To that end, let's get Andrew Scheer in here. He's the leader of the official opposition, and maybe he can shed some light on what at least ought to be aspirational in this extent. Andrew, good to have you back on the Oakley Show. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thanks very much for having me on.
So, off the top, how would you assess the federal government's response to this point on the whole thing, the situation, the very dynamic and fluid situation as it's been unfolding?
It is a very dynamic situation, and we are dealing with something that is virtually unprecedented. And so, we're all very aware of the fact that there are going to be some challenges that governments aren't normally dealing with. That being said, I think a lot of people have had questions about the government's handling of this, some of the confusion, even as late as this week, as to what the official recommendations and policies are. Last week, when we were in the House of Commons asking whether or not the government was going to close our borders, shut down travel from international destinations, we were told that wasn't on the table, that was not effective. Just a few days later, they changed their policy. So, it's important that the government calm people by having clear, concise, and consistent messaging, and we haven't always seen that. So that is something that we are concerned about. We're going to continue to pass on the questions that Canadians have as to why certain things are ruled out one day but then adopted the very next day.
Well, is your sense they're being reactive rather than proactive and getting well out in front of this thing?
Well, there are many early indications that this was a crisis that was going to be needed to be taken seriously. And it does seem on several fronts that we, as a country, the current government, is acting late, acting after other countries have made these types of decisions. There's an old adage about in hockey going to where the puck is going to be, not where it is today, and that's what I think Canadians wanted to see from this government, to say, okay, well, let's map this out. Where will we likely be in 5 to 10 days, and let's just get there right away so that we can minimize as much as humanly possible when you're dealing with something as difficult to manage as a global pandemic.
I guess a lot of this is going to be Monday morning quarterbacking, but did you think that maybe we should have had travel bans in place well before yesterday's announcement?
Well, yes, and certainly at the very least from some of the hot spots. When we're told that some countries are experiencing huge spikes, it seems to make sense that we would say, okay, but in the meantime, while we're still learning everything we possibly can about this virus and how it travels, we're going to take the minimal precaution of restricting entry into our country from places that are experiencing those types of spikes. And that is something that we all saw. We heard the stories last week about planes coming in from regions that had experienced those spikes and kind of business as usual at the airports that they were arriving in. Minister Bill Blair, public safety minister, told Canadians through a variety of channels that there were enhanced measures at airports. And then I saw my Twitter feed full of people returning to Canada from other countries where they were all lined up elbow to elbow in immigration lines without any hand sanitizer, without any information about COVID-19 or any expectations about what they were to do after they were entered into Canada. So there was a huge lag in terms of what the Liberal government was telling Canadians were in place and what was actually happening at the borders. And again, that doesn't instill people with confidence. People look to their government in times of a crisis like this, and they want to see that when decisions get made, when orders are sent out, that they're actually implemented.
Again, with Andrew Scheer, leader of the official opposition. And so there's this emergency recall of Parliament tomorrow. Bill Morneau is supposed to come out with a big announcement. That was also being, I guess, previewed earlier today with a press conference at lunch with a lot of the ministers. What are you hoping for is in that package, especially when it comes to employment assistance?
Mm-hmm. Well, what we're looking for is measures that will provide relief to Canadians who are experiencing hardships through no fault of their own. I've been in my constituency office the last few days, and the phone calls are coming in. I've heard from people who have, working in restaurants who've had their shifts canceled, small business owners who have had to close their doors or lay people off. So what we're going to be looking for is a responsive measures that address the people who are either falling through the cracks, or there is not yet a government program that would capture that. So, again, we're talking about people. This isn't a business that made a bad decision. This isn't a corporation who invested in the wrong company or something. These are people who through no fault of their own are now bearing the brunt of this. And there's a lot of anxiety out there. The mortgage payments are going to be due at the end of the month, rent payments for businesses, people who need to put food on the table for their families who are in precarious work or shift work. We're hearing from those types of people, and we want to make sure that the government's response addresses that.
Well, can you give me some specifics, though? How do you address that? Because there are some people who haven't paid into EI. They're not going to draw EI. Perhaps, potentially, they won't. Anyway, what do we do for these, workers who are vulnerable to not being able to put food on their table because nobody's calling? Let's say they're in a business where all of the calls have dried up, the service calls, or their wait staff. You know how this all works. What do they do?
Oh, for sure. I was a waiter when I was paying my way through university, and if you get a few shifts canceled, there's no real mechanism to get that back. There's no trigger to get that support. You, as a shift worker, you kind of build that into your regular flow. You're going to pick up some shifts, you're going to lose some shifts. In something like this, though, when it's a catastrophic drop in income for so many people, we're going to be calling on the government to fill in those gaps. So some of the discussions that have already been.
But how specifically? I mean, can you give me for instance, how would you do that? I mean, give them EI whereas they hadn't paid into it? Do you cut them a check? You give them tax relief? How does that work?
Well, I think when we're talking about tax relief, I think that is important. I think one of the easiest things the government can do is to not take as much money out of the economy as they normally do in a time like this. In terms of filling in for some of the programs, some of the ideas that have been floated that we're looking at, we're studying as a caucus, are using things like GST rebates. That is something that I have seen floated as an idea. I think that's worth pursuing. Whether or not it captures everybody, we'll have to kind of dig down and see is that the best and most adequate response. I mean, we all have to understand that we're going to be dealing with hundreds of thousands of Canadians who, again, through no fault of their own, just suddenly won't be able to make mortgage payments, rent payments, utility payments, and we have to understand that to get us through what could be a medium or long-term lasting effect of this, that we have to get creative here.
Yeah, again, though, I don't know what the specifics are to meet the needs of, say, the guy who's in a bar band or he's a solo act and now the bars are closed by fiat or decree of the government and the health people. He can't work, so he can't eat. He can't, he's not being paid. Where does he go for help?
Yeah, and that's exactly why I think it's important that Parliament does come back next week, because these are the types of things that we can look at and have officials from finance, present ideas or solutions that might work. Like I said, we have to get creative here. This isn't just one specific industry, that is going through this hardship. This is going to be across the board, across the country. Every type of industry, small business owners, entrepreneurs, shift workers, people who, I was chatting with someone who was talking to their Uber driver, and he normally made enough money every day to pay the rent. Now he's not. How do you capture that? So those are the things that our finance team is working on right now, and we'll have some more to say in the coming days. We'll see what the government proposes. We'll evaluate it, and then we'll also have our additional requests on how we believe we can address the very real concerns that Canadians have these days.
I hope so, because I'm hearing from a lot of people desperate, really desperate, anxiety-ridden for answers. But Andrew Scheer with us. Let me just ask you one or two more quick ones, because last hour we had Jerry Diaz on. He represents a broad swath of people with the unionized labor force. He's, of course, the head of Unifor, and he cited the airlines, for example. Now, in the States, Trump was saying at lunch, they're not going to let the airlines fail. They're going to bail them out in the cruise lines because they've taken an inordinate hit. Obviously, they're almost shut down by this thing. Do you think there is a place for rescuing some of these major industries?
Well, my guiding principle when I think about how the government interacts in the economy, it's really to protect people and workers from sector-wide collapses or natural disasters, things that you can't really plan for as a business. We don't expect the government to compensate for bad business decisions or if people stop buying one product and switch to another. That's the way the free market should work. But I wouldn't rule anything out right now, because at the end of the day, we're talking about keeping people working and keeping people in their jobs. And there's a variety of things the government can do in terms of helping companies through a sector-wide collapse. We've seen it done in the past during the last great global recession in terms of protecting the auto industry. There are models like that. But again, I wouldn't want to endorse any idea until I've actually seen the proposal. But nor would I rule anything out. When we're talking about keeping airlines afloat, we're talking about thousands of jobs. When we're talking about the service sector, we're talking about thousands of jobs. Maybe not for one or two companies, but for thousands of different companies. And so we really do need to take a look and say, how can the government, help through some of these things for what may end up being 3, 4, 5 months.
All right. We're hoping that Mr. Monod comes out with something substantive tomorrow, and as a fallout from that, we'll see where we go. Andrew Scheer, I thank you for joining us and giving us a sense for where you're at on all of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Andrew Scheer, leader of the official opposition. Yeah, because people are in the throes of desperation.